The cold bit through Leia Fernandez's coat long before she stepped off the bus. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of winter chill that slid under fabric, crawled along her ribs, and settled inside her bones like unwelcome truth. She pulled the zipper up as high as it would go, even though the metal teeth were already broken near the collar, leaving a small gap that let the wind stab her skin. Dawn hadn't arrived yet. The sky above Manhattan was a heavy gray bruise, and its silence seemed to judge her as she walked. She clutched the folder to her chest, holding it close, like a shield. Inside were the last pieces of hope she had scraped together. A printed resume, copies of outdated certificates from the life she lived before immigrating, and a letter from her landlord threatening eviction if she didn't pay the remaining balance in 3 days. The ink was still slightly smudged from where her tears had fallen the night she received it. She had cried quietly, so no one in the cramped apartment where she rented a couch would hear her. Everyone was struggling. No one needed another burden. As she made her way along the sidewalk, her shoes sank into patches of slush that seeped through the thin soles. Each step was a reminder of the years she had spent cleaning restaurants at night, wiping tables in diners where she could never afford to eat, and walking home under the glow of neon signs that sold dreams she didn't dare claim. She had arrived in the United States 3 years earlier, carrying nothing but the conviction that life had to be kinder somewhere. But kindness had been rare, and the city had a way of teaching humility through hunger. Today, though, she had allowed herself to hope again. The interview at the small accounting office wasn't glamorous, but it was her first real chance in months to escape the cycle of temporary jobs that barely allowed her to breathe. She had memorized her answers in English, whispering them to herself while scrubbing dishes. She practiced smiling in the mirror, even though she hardly recognized her reflection anymore. She checked the time on her cracked phone screen. 23 minutes until the interview. If she walked quickly, she would arrive right on time. The streets grew louder as she approached Midtown. Cars honked. Buses hissed as they braked. Steam rose through sidewalk grates like ghostly warnings. People in expensive coats rushed past her, eyes forward, steps confident. She kept her head down, careful not to bump into anyone. Invisible ways. Invisible. Her heart thudded harder as she approached the tall, glass building where the interview would take place. She could almost feel the weight of possibility pressing against its doors. She whispered a small prayer in Spanish, asking for strength, for luck, for the dignity she felt slipping away more each day. But as she stepped into the crosswalk, everything changed. On the opposite side of the street, a frail elderly woman lost her balance. The world seemed to slow as the woman's cane slid across the pavement, her thin legs buckling beneath her. She fell hard to hard and her handbag burst open, spilling pills, papers, and a framed photograph. Dozens of people looked. "Nonne stop." Leia froze for a heartbeat, torn between instinct and survival. She glanced at the building. 17 minutes left. She could still make it if she kept moving. She could still save herself. Then she saw the woman struggle to breathe. Her decision came like an exhale. She ran. Kneeling on the freezing sidewalk, Leia set her folder down and placed trembling hands on the woman's shoulders. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman winced in pain, eyes unfocused, lips pale. Leia carefully helped her sit upright. The cold from the pavement seeped through Leia's jeans instantly, but she didn't care. She pulled off her own scarf, fraying, and wrapped it gently around the woman's neck. "It's okay. I'm here. You're not alone." The woman's fingers clutched hers with desperate strength, as if holding on to a stranger could keep her anchored to the world. Leia's own heart hammered in her chest, but her voice stayed soft and steady. She called for an ambulance, giving precise details, even as her teeth chattered. A few passers-by glanced over but continued on their way. The city had no time for weakness. But Leia remained. She checked her phone, again. 12 minutes. She swallowed the rising panic. She had made her choice. Kindness didn't wait for convenience. The old woman's breathing eased slightly, and she leaned into Leia like a child leaning toward safety. When the paramedics arrived, they assessed the situation quickly, placing the woman on a stretcher. But as they lifted her, the woman grabbed Leia's wrist with surprising force, her voice a whisper barely audible over the sirens. "Please, don't leave me." The words pierced straight through Leah's chest. She hesitated, torn apart by the collision of two desperate futures. But when the woman's eyes filled with fear, Leah made her choice again just as instinctively, just as fiercely. "I'm coming with you," she said. Inside the ambulance, as the siren wailed and lights flashed across the walls, Leah felt everything unravel. The last hope she had clung to for weeks slipped away like warmth from her numb fingers. The interview was gone. Her chance at stability was gone. The landlord's deadline would crush her. She had never felt the universe so heavy on her shoulders. But when she looked at the old woman lying on the street, trembling, alone, something inside, Leah stayed strangely steady. She didn't regret stopping. Not for a second. The woman opened her eyes briefly and murmured a name as the ambulance sped through traffic. "Eleanor." Leah squeezed her hand gently. "I'm here, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere." And as the ambulance vanished into the waking city, Leah felt the world shift in a way she couldn't yet understand, an invisible thread, pulling her toward a future she never imagined, shaped by a single act of compassion on a morning when she had nothing left to give. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and overheated air, the kind that always reminded Leah of long nights in emergency rooms back in Honduras, when she would sit beside her grandmother's bed, holding her hand, praying she would wake up. Now, she sat in a stiff plastic chair beside a stranger, her scarf still wrapped gently around the woman's thin neck. Nurses moved around them in hurried rhythms, their voices clipped, their footsteps purposeful. Everything felt fast except Eleanor, who remained frighteningly still. Leah watched as doctors examined the old woman, checking vitals and murmuring medical terms she barely understood. Every few minutes they reassured her, though no one seemed to question why she was there. Perhaps they assumed she was family. The thought made her stomach twist. Family was something she had lost piece by piece, the closer she came to chasing survival in a foreign land. Hours slipped by like lazy shadows crawling along the floor. When the doctors finally stabilized Eleanor and moved her to a private room, they allowed Leah to walk beside the stretcher. She felt strangely protective, as though the elderly woman's fragility tethered her to a purpose she hadn't expected. She sat at her bedside long after the paramedics left, her fingers curled around Eleanor's cold hand. A nurse entered and paused, observing how tightly they were connected. "Family?" the nurse asked. Her tone was gentle, not suspicious, just a routine question. Leah hesitated. "No. I found her on the street." The nurse nodded as if this wasn't surprising at all. "She'll wake up soon. You can stay a little longer." A little longer. A little longer. Those three words wrapped around her like borrowed warmth. As long as she stayed here, she didn't have to face the brutal reality outside. The lost interview, the eviction notice, the fact that she had spent her last few dollars on the bus ride. For now, she had a reason to stay in this bright, sterile room, where the world felt paused. When Eleanor finally stirred, her eyelids fluttering, as though she were waking from a long and difficult dream, Leah leaned forward. "Hi," she whispered softly. "You're safe." The old woman blinked slowly, disoriented. She looked from the four dripping beside her to Leah's face, confusion clouding her expression. You stayed?" "La, I couldn't leave." A tremor passed through Eleanor's lips, something like gratitude or, perhaps, disbelief that someone had chosen her over their own life. She reached for Leah's hand again, her voice frail. "Thank you, dear." "What's your name?" "Leah Fernandez." "Leah," Eleanor repeated, letting the name linger. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Before Leah could ask who, the door burst open. A man entered, tall, sharp-featured, shoulders stiff under a tailored coat. His presence filled the room in a way that made the air tense. His eyes went first to his mother, then to Leah, narrowing as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he didn't trust. "Mother," he said, approaching quickly. "What happened? Why didn't anyone call me sooner?" Eleanor sighed. "Michael, please, lower your voice." He ignored her request, turning to the nurse. "How long has she been here?" The nurse explained briefly, mentioning that someone had stayed with Eleanor since the moment she arrived. Michael's gaze followed the nurse's gesture back to Leah. His eyes were analytical, guarded, almost cold. Who are you? He asked. Leah felt heat rush to her cheeks. Her English suddenly felt fragile in her mouth. I helped your mother. She fell. On the street. Michael stared at her, unreadable. And you came in the ambulance with her? Yes. What? The question stunk. Why? Because she was human, because she saw someone suffering and couldn't walk away, because she knew what loneliness looked like. She swallowed the answer she wanted to give and forced out something simpler. She asked me not to leave. Michael exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between skepticism and something he wasn't ready to admit. Emotion, maybe, fear, perhaps. He turned back to his mother. Are you okay? Eleanor nodded weakly. Thanks to her. And just to be clear, he said, glancing again at Leah, you and my mother don't know each other. No, Leah whispered. Before he could interrogate her further, Eleanor lifted her hand. Stop, Michael. She's not a threat. She's kind. Michael's jaw tightened. Kindness, Leah suspected, was not a quality he trusted easily, but Eleanor wasn't done. I want her to stay. Leah blinked, startled. Stay! Yes, Eleanor said firmly, a spark returning to her eyes. At least until I'm discharged. Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his posture. Mother, she's a stranger. You can't just. I can, Eleanor interrupted, her tone firm enough to silence him. And I will. Leah felt torn between gratitude and fear. This man clearly didn't want her here, and she didn't want trouble. But she also knew she couldn't afford to return to the world outside just yet. Not with no money, no job, and an eviction threatening to throw her onto the streets. I don't want to be a problem, she said softly. You're not, Eleanor insisted. You're the only person who stopped to help me. That means something. The sincerity in her voice dissolved some of the tension in the room. Michael looked at his mother really, looked tan. Something in his expression softened, even if only slightly. He sighed. Fine, he said reluctantly, if that's what you want. The next day, Eleanor was discharged. Michael arranged transport home and, despite his visible discomfort, allowed Leah to accompany them. The ride was quiet, the city passing outside the tinted windows like a world Leah had never been allowed to enter. When they reached Eleanor's house of vast, elegant brownstone on a quiet street, Leah felt her breath catch. It wasn't just a house. It was wealth woven into brick and wood, the kind of wealth she had only seen from afar. The front door alone looked more valuable than everything she owned combined. Eleanor insisted she come inside. The interior was warm, filled with vintage paintings, crystal lamps, and a staircase that curved like the spine of an old novel. But there was something else. Something deeper, silence too heavy for such a beautiful place, as though laughter had once lived here but fled long ago. Michael watched them from the hallway, arms crossed, suspicion never fully leaving his face. But his mother's voice softened everything once more. Leah, she said, resting a frail hand over hers, I would like you to stay for tea. Just tea. Please. Leah hesitated. She didn't belong here. She had no right to step into this kind of world. But she saw something in Eleanor's eyes, a longing, a loneliness so profound it echoed her own. Okay. The tea was untouched. The china set looked priceless, thin pearl white, rimmed with gold, and Leah felt terrified to even breathe near it. Eleanor watched her with a soft, almost maternal curiosity. You're so tense, dear. You're safe here. Her eyes darted around the living room, its silent fireplace, its immaculate bookshelves, the heavy velvet curtains that made the space feel like a museum frozen in time. Everything looked beautiful, untouchable, and impossibly far from the world she came from. I'm sure it's very good, Leah said, embarrassed. You don't have to impress me, dear. Just be yourself. She lifted the teacup carefully, the porcelain almost weightless between her fingers. The scent was delicate, floral, nothing like the strong chamomile she grew up brewing in a dented pot at home. She took a sip. It warmed her tongue, then her throat, and slowly spread through her chest like a kind of gentleness she hadn't felt in years. Good? Eleanor asked. Leah nodded. Varia. Silence settled again. But this time it wasn't too uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, like both women were slowly trying to understand the presence of the other. Minutes later, the front door opened. Michael stepped in, carrying a stack of documents, business papers, contracts, something official looking. His coat was dusted with snowflakes. His expression was tight, as though he had been wrestling with himself all day. When he noticed them sitting together, his eyebrows drew together. "You're still here," he said to Leah. Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Of course she is." "I didn't mean." Michael paused, correcting his tone. "I'm just surprised." Leah lowered her gaze, unsure whether to stand, apologize, or vanish. Her instinct was always to shrink whenever someone looked at her with suspicion. But Eleanor reached for her hand again. "She kept me company. She was kind to me, and we need more kindness in this house." Michael let out a slow sigh, long enough to soften the edges of his posture. He placed the documents on a nearby table. "Mother, you can't get attached so quickly." "I'm not a child," Eleanor said. "I know what I'm doing." "You barely know her. And you barely know kindness," she replied, her eyes narrowing, not in anger but in a sadness that felt deeply rooted. Michael flinched as if the words hit an old bruise. He turned toward the window, staring out at the falling snow. "I'm just trying to look out for you." "I don't need protecting from her," Eleanor said, and her voice carried a certainty that felt almost fierce. Leah felt like an intruder listening to a family's hidden wounds. She set her cup down carefully and stood. "Maybe I should go." "No," Eleanor said at once. "Please stay a little more. You make the house feel warm." Michael glanced at her again, and this time, his expression was different. Not fully trusting, not fully skeptical, but something in between. A quiet curiosity, a question he wasn't ready to ask aloud. "Mother," he said softly, "we have to talk about your doctor's recommendations." "No," she replied immediately. "I'm tired of doctors. I want to talk to Leah." He sighed again but didn't push further. Instead, he stepped out of the room, perhaps to give them space or, perhaps because her presence unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. Once he was gone, Eleanor's voice shifted. Lower, more intimate. "He's a good man, you know, but hurt. Too much hurt, for too many years." Leah didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. "He lost his wife," Eleanor continued quietly, 6 years ago. Since then, he's buried himself in work. He thinks emotions are dangerous." Her eyes softened. "But I can see he noticed you." Leah felt heat flood her cheeks. No. "He just doesn't trust me." "Maybe," Eleanor said, her smile knowing. "But he looked at you, really looked, and he hasn't done that with anyone in a very long time." Leah shook her head, embarrassed. "I'm not? I mean, I don't belong in this place, or near people like him." "Nonsense." "It's true," Leah insisted, her voice cracking a little. "I clean houses, primera wash, dices. I sleep on someone's couch. I can't even afford a winter coat." Eleanor reached out, placing her hand over Leah's heart. Her touch was warm, unexpectedly steady. "This," she said softly, "is what makes you belong anywhere. Not money, not background." This, Leah felt tears burn the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. Then Eleanor spoke the sentence that would change everything. "Leah, I don't want you to leave. I want to offer you a job here. With me." Leah froze. "A job, yes. As my companion, someone to help me, keep me company, make sure I don't fall again." Her voice cracked. "I've been alone for too long." The offer felt unreal. Impossible. Too generous. Too dangerous. She couldn't accept, not with her immigration status hanging over her like a shadow ready to swallow her whole. The words sliced through the air. Leah's breath caught. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Shame swept through her like a tidal wave. "You don't have to be afraid of me," Eleanor said gently. "Not here." Not in this house. It's okay, Eleanor whispered, squeezing her hand. You're safe. Then Michael returned. Before Leah could force an answer, Eleanor spoke. I've offered her a job here, she said calmly, and she's going to accept. Leah's heart stopped. Michael stared, stunned. Mother, are you serious? That's not a simple decision. You don't know anything about her. I know everything I need to, Eleanor replied. Michael exhaled slowly, frustration tightening every muscle in his face. But beneath it, something else flickered. Fear. Of chains, fear. Of vulnerability, fear of this stranger who had suddenly become important to his mother. Leah realized then that this house, these people, this moment. 4 weeks, Leah lived in a quiet rhythm that felt almost unreal, waking early to help Eleanor dress, preparing gentle breakfasts with the care she had once given her grandmother, listening to the older woman recount memories of a world far gentler than the one Leah had survived. The brownstone, once cold and echoing with absence, began to feel alive again. Eleanor's laughter returned, soft at first, then fuller, like a melody, rediscovering its notes. Even Michael, though guarded, visited more often, lingering in rooms he usually crossed quickly, his presence shifting from obligation to something harder to define. Some mornings Leah caught him watching her as she braided Eleanor's silver hair or read aloud from her dusty novels. He would stand in the doorway, arms loosely crossed, his face caught between curiosity and reluctance. Their conversations were brief, polite, slightly awkward, but slowly, almost reluctantly, the tension between them softened. But under the surface of all that warmth, fear lingered. It followed Leah like a shadow as she moved through the house. It whispered in her ear as she washed dishes in the quiet evenings. It tightened her chest whenever the doorbell rang unexpectedly. She hadn't told Michael the truth, not fully. Eleanor knew, or at least understood, but Michael, she sensed that his caution wasn't just pride. It was protection. It was responsibility. It was fear of losing the last family he had left, and she didn't want to be the threat that triggered that loss. One morning, after a soft snowfall turned the streets into muted painterly strokes, Leah walked Eleanor carefully to the living room window, where she liked to sit and watch children play on the sidewalk. The light fell warmly across the older woman's face. She looked peaceful, almost youthful. You've brought life back into this house, Eleanor said quietly. Leah smiled. You've given me a life, too. Their hands touched warmth against warmth. A bond that needed no explanation. It was then that Eleanor said something that made Leah's breath hitch. You know, she murmured, I could imagine you as part of this family. Leah froze. Eleanor, I'm serious. You have a heart that matches what Michael needs, what he's forgotten, he even wants. The words wrapped around Leah like a blanket and a blade, at the same time comforting and terrifying. No, she whispered. He wouldn't. You think? I don't see the way he looks at you. Leah swallowed hard. He barely trusts me. He barely trusts himself, Eleanor corrected, and that's much harder to heal. Before Leah could reply, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Eleanor leaned back slightly, falling silent just as Michael appeared, carrying a small stack of mail. He greeted his mother with a kiss on the head, then nodded politely toward Leah. Morning, he said. Good morning, she replied, hiding the emotional turbulence she still felt from Eleanor's words. But something was off about him today. His movements were tense, his gaze more distant than usual. He handed Eleanor her mail, sorting through the envelopes, and then paused when he saw one with unusual markings. His expression darkened. He turned to Leah. Can we talk for a moment? Leah's heart clenched. Of course. Eleanor looked worried, but didn't interfere. Leah followed Michael into the hallway, where the walls felt suddenly too narrow, too close. He lowered his voice. I need you to be completely honest with me. Fear trickled down her spine like ice water. About what? He held up the envelope. It was addressed to the house, but it bore the official seal she had dreaded every day since she arrived in the country. Immigration Services. Her knees weakened. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "It came in the general mail," Michael said. "Not with your name, obviously, but we need to talk about your status." Her breath vanished. She tried to speak, but words tangled and died in her throat. "Leah," he insisted, his voice tight, but not cruel. "Are you undocumented?" Her silence was answer enough. Michael exhaled sharply and raked a trembling hand through his hair. He stepped back, as though he needed space to process. "Why didn't you tell me? I was scared," she whispered. "I thought you'd send me away." "I wouldn't have," he said quickly, before catching himself. "At least, don't think I would have." His voice cracked slightly, revealing the conflict inside him. She saw the weight he carried, the responsibility he felt toward his mother, the fear of letting someone into their fragile world. "Does my mother know?" he asked. Leah nodded slowly. She figured it out. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. Of course she did. His silence stretched long enough to terrify her. But then he looked at her again, and something in his expression soft. "I don't want you to leave. Not like this. Not scared, not alone." Her throat tightened. "Then what do I do?" "We figure it out," he said, "together." For the first time since she arrived in America, someone offered her a future instead of a warning. But fate had its own plans. 2 days later, while Leah worked her second job at a nearby restaurant washing dishes to earn extra income despite Eleanor insisting she didn't, two immigration officers arrived for a routine audit, the kind of random check that destroyed fragile lives. The manager panicked. Workers scattered, but Leah, who didn't have time or space to hide, found herself cornered near the metal sink, her hands still wet from the soap. "Identification," the officer demanded. Her body went cold. I don't have it," she stammered. She was escorted out of the restaurant, the winter air striking her like a slap. People watched. Workers whispered. Shame burned her skin, but fear hollowed her from the inside. In the back of the van, her mind spiraled Eleanor, her job, Michael, the small piece she had found, the fragile future that had begun to bloom. Everything was slipping away. They allowed her one call. Her shaking fingers dialed the only number she knew by heart now. Michael answered instantly. "Leah, where are you?" Her voice broke. "Michael, they took me." No, stay calm. "I'm coming. Please," she whispered, tears falling. "Don't let them take me away." "I won't," he said, his voice fierce, breathless, as if he were already running. Promise. I'm going to get you out of this." But promises were fragile things, and the world was about to show all three of them, Leah, Michael, and Eleanor, how quickly a life built on hope could collapse under the weight of a single unyielding system. The holding center was colder than the streets Leah had slept on when she first arrived in the country. The air smelled of metal, disinfectant, and quiet despair, an odor she instantly recognized as the scent of lives interrupted. Leah's hands trembled as she clutched the thin blanket they had given her, but her mind trembled even more. The promise had felt like a lifeline, something warm and solid she could hold on to as officers escorted her through metal doors. Hours passed. Maybe days' time dissolved in the fluorescent haze. Every time they walked past her cell, her heart cracked a little more. Then finally footsteps stopped. A key turned. The door opened. Leah stood so quickly, her knees nearly buckled. He reached her in 3 long strides, placing his hands on her shoulders as if to assure himself she was real. She shook her head. "Don't," he interrupted. "Don't blame yourself. Not for surviving, not for helping my mother, not for being human." His touch was warmer than anything around her. She closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry, not to collapse in front of him. "I brought someone," Asai softly. Then Eleanor appeared behind him, supported by a guard, her steps slow but determined. Her face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. "Leah," she murmured, reaching for her. Eleanor. Leah breathed, tears spilling freely now. "Why are you here?" "You should be resting." "I'll rest when you're safe." The older woman's hand shook as she touched Leah's cheek. "I won't lose you," Do you understand? You are not alone. Michael turned to the officer. We're posting bail, and I've hired an attorney, one of the best. She's preparing emergency filings. We're not letting her be deported. The officer nodded, then stepped away to handle paperwork. Leah stared at them both, overwhelmed. Why? She whispered, her voice cracking. Why would you fight for me like this? I'm nobody. No, Eleanor said, her tone trembling with emotion. You are exactly the person this family needed. You saved me when no one else cared. You brought warmth back into a house that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. And you reminded my son that life isn't meant to be lived behind walls. Michael's voice softened. You matter, Leah. You matter more than you realize. Her chest tightened, heavy with gratitude and disbelief. She wanted to trust their words, to believe she had a place in a world that had always pushed her to the sidelines. But fear still gripped her, fear of losing everything again. Will they? Will they let me stay? She whispered. Michael hesitated, but, only for a second. We'll make them. Whatever it takes. More waiting followed, but this time it was different. This time she wasn't alone. Eleanor held her hand, and Michael stood by the door, refusing to sit as though remaining upright was the only way to keep her safe. Eventually, the officer returned. She's released into your custody, he said, nodding toward Michael. Relief hit Leah so hard her legs nearly gave out. When she stepped outside, winter air rushed into her lungs, sharp and cold, but it felt like the freshest breath she had taken in years. Michael helped her into the car. Eleanor held her hand the entire drive home, and when they reached the brownstone, its lights glowing softly against the night, something inside Leah shifted. The house no longer felt like a silent museum. It felt like possibility, fragile, uncertain, but real. Days turned into weeks, as paperwork, meetings, and legal filings filled their lives. Michael barely slept, devoting himself to building a case that would allow Leah to stay. Eleanor attended every meeting, every appointment, no matter how tired she became, and Leah, overwhelmed by the sacrifice being made for her, poured herself into caring for Eleanor with renewed devotion. She cooked meals, tidied the house, and read to her every evening, cherishing every moment. One night, after Eleanor fell asleep in her armchair, Leah found Michael in the study, surrounded by documents. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, tie loosened, posture sagging. But when he looked up at her, something softened. You shouldn't work yourself this hard, she said quietly. I'm not just doing this for you, he replied. I'm doing it for my mother. You make her happy. That matters. She approached him slowly, unsure, her heart racing. And for you? She asked. He studied her for several seconds, then exhaled, the sound full of vulnerability he had never shown her before. Yes, he finally whispered. For me too? The confession hung between them, raw, fragile, undeniable. Michael? She whispered. He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. You changed something in me, Leah. Something I thought was gone forever. Her heart pounded. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, he said, shaking his head. You're the first good thing that's happened to this family in years. The space between them dissolved. Their foreheads touched, gentle, trembling as, though neither dared to break the moment. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it carried the promise of one. A promise of something deeper. It took months. Court hearings, evaluations, endless documents. But on a bright spring morning, sunlight pouring through the courthouse windows, the judge delivered a decision that made Leah's knees weaken all over again. Her immigration case was approved. She could stay. Legally. Safely. Permanently. She turned to Michael and Eleanor, tears spilling down her cheeks. Eleanor cried openly, clutching her hands. Michael embraced her carefully at first, then fully complete. Leah, as though he knew she needed someone to hold her upright. When they finally stepped outside, Leah lifted her face to the sun, letting the warmth bathe her. For the first time since she left her home, the world felt like it wasn't trying to push her away. It felt like it was welcoming her. Years later, the brownstone was no longer silent. It echoed with laughter, footsteps, conversations, dinners shared around a long table. Eleanor's health stabilized, comforted by the family she had found in her final years. And, after she passed peacefully in her sleep, she left her home and her considerable estate to Michael and Leah. Together, they built something beautiful, a foundation offering legal help, financial support, and community resources for immigrants. Leah became its beating heart, its guiding force. Her story inspired thousands. She became a millionaire, not through luck, but through purpose. But her wealth meant less to her than the moment she stood on a stage before a crowded room, sharing the message she had lived. Kindness is the door that opens all the others. It saved me. It saved a family, and it can save so many more. Michael stood in the front row, pride shining in his eyes, and Leah knew without doubt, without fear, that she had become exactly what Eleanor once wished. A daughter of the house. A woman with a future, a life reborn from a single moment of compassion on a winter morning when she thought she had nothing left to give.